Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the most chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the haunting forests of Michigan, a state known for its natural beauty and its terrifying legends. From the sorrowful cries at Sleeping Bear Dunes to the monstrous Dogman of Manistee, these 5 camping stories will make you think twice about exploring Michigan's wilderness. Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. Story number 1. The Whales of Sleeping Bear Dunes. I've always been a skeptic, the kind of guy who rolls his eyes at ghost stories and urban legends. As a freelance journalist, I prefer facts over fiction. So when my editor assigned me to cover the local legends of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in Michigan, I was less than thrilled. "Come on, Alex," she had said, sliding the folder across her cluttered desk. "It's a beautiful place, and the readers love a good spooky tale this time of year." I sighed, flipping through the pages. Ghost stories? Really? Think of it as a paid vacation. Go, enjoy the scenery, and if you happen to hear any ghostly wails, well, there's your story. And that's how I found myself driving up the winding roads of northern Michigan. The autumn leaves painting the landscape in fiery hues of red and gold. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, endless blue, hardly the setting for anything remotely frightening. I arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. There were a few other campers scattered around, but the place was mostly deserted. I set up my tent near the edge of the forest, where the dunes began their gentle rise toward the lake. An elderly ranger named Tom came by to check on me. "Evening," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Beautiful spot you've got here." "Sure is," I agreed. "I'm Alex, by the way." "Tom, you new to these parts?" "Just visiting, doing a piece on local legends." He raised an eyebrow. "Ah, so you're here about the crying." I chuckled. "You've heard the stories then?" "More than I care to, truth be told." He glanced toward the dunes, his eyes narrowing. "Be careful out there. The lake has a way of playing tricks on folks." Before I could ask him to elaborate, he tipped his hat again and moved on. As night fell, I built a small fire and settled in with my notebook. The sky was a canopy of stars, the Milky Way cutting a luminous path overhead. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Around midnight, just as I was considering turning in, I heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. First, I thought it was the cry of an animal, but as I listened, it became unmistakably human. A woman's wail, filled with sorrow. I sat up straight, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound ebbed and flowed, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then swelling again. It seemed to come from the dunes. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam toward the sandy hills. Nothing but the shifting shadows cast by the moonlight. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" No response, just the mournful crying continuing, now accompanied by what sounded like whispers, unintelligible but undeniably voices. I should have stayed put, but curiosity, or perhaps something stronger, drove me forward. I left the safety of the fire and headed toward the dunes. The sand was cool under my feet, the grains shifting with each step. As I climbed, the wailing grew louder, more intense. It seemed to wrap around me, pressing in from all sides. At the crest of the dune, I stopped to catch my breath. The vast expanse of Lake Michigan stretched out before me, the water shimmering under the moonlight like a sheet of liquid silver. Then I saw her. A figure stood at the water's edge, dressed in what appeared to be a long gown that billowed in the breeze. Her hair was dark, cascading over her shoulders. Beside her were 2 smaller figures, children by their stature. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. The children clung to her, and she seemed to be gazing out over the lake. I scrambled down the dune, half sliding, half running. As I got closer, I noticed that there was something off about the way they stood, too still, like statues. "Ma'am," I called out, Approaching cautiously, they vanished. One moment they were there, the next nothing. Just empty shoreline and the gentle lapping of waves. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Had I imagined it? Was the lack of sleep catching up with me? A cold gust of wind swept over me, and with it came the unmistakable sound of laughter. A child's giggle, light and airy. "Hello!" I spun around, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam illuminated only the swaying grasses and the deserted beach. Then, from behind me, a whisper, "Help us!" I whipped around. No one. My heart pounded in my chest. This was ridiculous. Ghosts weren't real. There had to be a logical explanation. I retreated back to my campsite, my pace brisk. The wailing resumed, more distant now but no less haunting. Back at the fire, I sat down and tried to collect my thoughts. Maybe it was the wind, or some acoustical effect of the dunes. I resolved to investigate further in the morning. Sleep came fitfully, my dreams plagued by images of the woman and her children. The next day, I visited the local visitor center, hoping to find some historical context. A middle-aged woman named Linda managed the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked with a warm smile. "I was wondering if you could tell me about any local legends, specifically about a woman and her children associated with the dunes." Her smile faded. "You're not the first to ask." She pulled out a worn binder from beneath the counter. "There's an old Native American legend about the sleeping bear. I've heard bits and pieces. Mind filling me in?" She opened the binder to a page with a faded illustration of a large bear lying on a dune. According to the legend, a mother bear and her 2 cubs tried to cross Lake Michigan to escape a forest fire in Wisconsin. The swim was too much for the cubs, and they lagged behind. The mother reached the shore and waited, but the cubs drowned. The Great Spirit Manitou created 2 islands to mark where the cubs disappeared and a dune to represent the mother bear watching and waiting. "That's tragic," I said, feeling a pang of sadness. "Some say that the spirits of the mother and her cubs still linger," Linda continued, "but others have reported seeing a woman and her children. There was a shipwreck in the late 1800s. A mother and her 2 kids were among the lost. Do you believe the stories?" She hesitated. "I've lived here all my life. There are things that happen out there that can't be explained." I told her about my experience the previous night. She listened intently, her expression grave. "Be careful," she warned. "Sometimes the spirits are restless. They may be seeking something." "Like what?" "Closure. Or perhaps they're lost and looking for a way home." I thanked her and decided to spend the day hiking, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling. That night, I built the fire higher, its warmth and light a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. I debated whether to stay another night, but convinced myself that I was overreacting. Around midnight, the wailing began again, softer this time but more plaintive. It tugged at something deep within me, a profound sense of grief. Then came the footsteps, light, almost imperceptible, circling the perimeter of my campsite. I stood up, flashlight in hand. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I felt a chill behind me, as if someone were standing just inches away. I spun around, the beam of light slicing through the night. Nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I was being watched. "Please," a child's voice whispered. "Help us." My throat tightened. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Silence. Then, movement at the edge of the light, a shadow slipping between the trees. I followed it, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. "Wait!" I called out. The shadow moved deeper into the forest, and I pursued, branches snagging at my clothes. Ahead, a faint glow appeared, flickering like a lantern. As I approached, the glow intensified, resolving into the figures of the woman and her children. They stood beside a massive oak tree, their forms translucent and wavering. "Please," the woman whispered, her eyes meeting mine. They were filled with such sorrow that it made my chest ache. "How can I help you?" I asked, swallowing hard. She extended her hand. pointing toward the base of the tree. I looked down to see a patch of disturbed earth, the soil darker as if recently turned. Kneeling, I brushed away the leaves and debris, revealing a small, weathered locket half buried in the dirt. I picked it up carefully. It was cold to the touch, despite having been in the ground. Opening it, I found a faded photograph of the woman and her children. "You've been looking for this?" I asked, glancing back up. They were gone. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves, and with it came a sense of peace, as if a weight had been lifted from the air. I returned to my campsite, the locket clutched tightly in my hand. The next day, I visited the local historical society, locket in tow. An archivist named Margaret assisted me. "This is quite old," she remarked, examining it with care. "Where did you find it?" "Out near the dunes," I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "It might belong to one of the families from the shipwreck of 1891. The SS Western Star went down during a sudden storm. Many lives were lost." I told her about the woman and her children. Margaret sighed softly. "There are tales of spirits lingering, unable to move on because they have unfinished business. Do you think returning this could help? Perhaps. Sometimes. All it takes is for someone to acknowledge their presence." I left the locket with her, hoping it would find its way to any surviving relatives or at least be preserved. That night was my last at the dunes. As darkness fell, I felt a strange calm settle over the area. No wails, no footsteps, just the soothing sounds of nature. I slept deeply, undisturbed. In the morning, as I packed up, Tom the ranger appeared. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Got what I came for." He smiled faintly. "Looks like you found more than just stories." I nodded. Maybe there's more truth to them than I thought. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something profound. The skeptic in me grappled with the experiences. But deep down, I knew some stories persist because they're true, echoing through time like the cries on the wind. Back home, I wrote the article, a blend of history and personal experience. I didn't embellish or sensationalize, just told the story as it happened. The response was overwhelming. Readers shared their own encounters, their brushes with the unexplained. And every now and then, on quiet nights, I think back to the dunes, to the sorrowful wails and the fleeting figures under the moonlight. I still don't believe in ghosts, not entirely, but I believe in the lingering echoes of the past, in the unresolved emotions that tether souls to this world. If you ever find yourself at Sleeping Bear Dunes under a starlit sky, listen closely. You might hear them, the whispers of those long gone, seeking closure, seeking peace, and perhaps, if you're open to it, you might help them find their way home. Story number 2. The haunting melody of Porcupine Mountains. I've always been a sucker for the great outdoors. Growing up in the concrete jungle of Chicago, the idea of sprawling forests and towering mountains was something of a fantasy. So when my friend Mike suggested a camping trip to the Porcupine Mountains in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I jumped at the chance. A week away from the hustle and bustle, immersed in nature's tranquility, it sounded like heaven. We set out in late September, hoping to catch the fall colors at their peak. The drive up was long but pleasant, the landscape gradually shifting from urban sprawl to rolling hills and dense woods. By the time we reached the park entrance, the sun was dipping low, casting a warm golden glow over the treetops. "Ready for an adventure?" Mike grinned, pulling on his backpack. "Always," I replied, matching his enthusiasm. We had planned a 3-day hike along some of the less traveled trails, eager to escape the crowds and find a slice of wilderness to call our own. The first day was perfect. The weather was crisp but not cold, the leaves a riot of reds and oranges, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of birds. That night, we set up camp near the edge of Lake of the Clouds. The water was still, reflecting the starlit sky like a mirror. As we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Ever hear any of the local legends? Mike asked, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Can't say I have. I admitted. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They say this place is haunted. I laughed. Haunted? By what? Bears? No, seriously, he insisted. There's talk of a woman's voice singing, out in the woods at night. They call her the Lady of the Forest. I raised an eyebrow. And what's her story? Depends on who you ask. Some say she was a settler who lost her husband to the wilderness. Others say she's a Native American spirit, mourning the loss of her people. But everyone agrees on one thing: if you hear her song, you shouldn't follow it. Why's that? Because those who do never come back. I chuckled, shaking my head. That's just campfire talk. Maybe, Mike said, settling back in his chair. But don't say I didn't warn you. We turned in shortly after, the allure of our sleeping bags too strong to resist. The tent was cozy, and exhaustion pulled me under almost immediately. Sometime in the night, I awoke to a soft sound. First, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was something else entirely. A melody. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A woman's voice, singing a hauntingly beautiful song. I sat up, straining to listen. The lyrics were in a language I didn't understand, but the emotion behind them was palpable: sorrow, longing, a touch of despair. Mike, I whispered, nudging him. Wake up. He grumbled, pulling his sleeping bag over his head. What is it? Do you hear that? He listened for a moment, then shrugged. It's just the wind. Go back to sleep. But I couldn't. The song seemed to wrap around me, pulling me toward it, without fully realizing what I was doing. I slipped on my boots and unzipped the tent. The night air was cool, and the forest was bathed in silver moonlight. I took a few steps away from the campsite, the melody growing slightly louder. Hello, I called softly. Is someone there? No response, just the continuation of that mournful song. I glanced back at the tent, considering waking Mike again, but decided against it. He'd just think I was being paranoid. Driven by curiosity, I followed the sound. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more intense the song became. It was as if the forest itself was amplifying it, the trees carrying the notes from somewhere far away. The path grew less defined, and I had to watch my step to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. After what felt like 20 minutes, I stopped, realizing how far I'd come. The rational part of my brain kicked in, chastising me for wandering off alone at night. I decided to head back, but when I turned around, the path was gone. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction looked the same: endless trees and shadows. Mike! I shouted, hoping my voice would carry. Silence. The singing had stopped, replaced by an oppressive quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. I fumbled for my phone, grateful for the flashlight feature. As I scanned the area, the beam caught something pale between the trees, a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Her long hair cascaded over her shoulders, and though her back was to me, I could tell she was the source of the singing. Excuse me, I called out, relief mingling with confusion. I'm lost. Can you help me? She turned slowly, and my relief turned to dread. Her face was ethereal but lacked any discernible features. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, porcelain mask. Yet, somehow, I knew she was looking at me. A chill ran down my spine. I need to get back to my campsite, I stammered. She raised a hand, beckoning me forward. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The air grew colder, my breaths forming clouds of mist. She began to sing again, the melody now laced with something darker, more insistent. I managed to tear my gaze away and bolted in the opposite direction. Branches whipped at my face, underbrush snagging my clothes. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing. The sky above was beginning to lighten, a hint of dawn on the horizon. But this wasn't our campsite. Exhausted and disoriented, I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath. Lost, I jolted, turning to see an old man standing nearby. He wore a ranger's uniform, but it looked outdated, the fabric worn and faded. Yes, I admitted, I can't find my campsite. He nodded thoughtfully. Many lose their way in these woods. Can you help me? He tilted his head. Perhaps, but you must be careful. The forest doesn't take kindly to trespassers. I'm not trespassing, I protested. I'm just camping with my friend. He gave a faint smile. She lured you, didn't she? Who? The lady of the forest. I stared at him. You know about her? More than most. His eyes bore into mine. She seeks souls to join her in her eternal lament. I shook my head. I just want to find my friend and leave. He gestured to a narrow path. Follow this trail. It will lead you back. Do not stray, no matter what you hear. Thank you, I said, relief washing over me. As I started down the path, he called after me. And whatever you do, don't listen to the song. I glanced back, but he was gone. The trail was faint but discernible, and I hurried along, eager to reunite with Mike. The forest around me was awakening, the sounds of birds chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But then, faintly at first, the singing resumed. I quickened my pace. Come back, the voice whispered, echoing among the trees. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to seep into my mind. Stay with me. A figure appeared ahead on the path. The woman, her featureless face tilted as if in sorrow. I stopped, fear paralyzing me. You cannot escape, she intoned, her voice resonating inside my skull, summoning every ounce of willpower. I squeezed my eyes shut and barreled forward, running straight through where she stood. There was a cold sensation, like passing through a mist, but I didn't stop. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I burst into our campsite, tripping and falling to my knees. Mike, I shouted. He emerged from the tent, eyes wide. Where the hell have you been? I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. We need to leave. Now. He frowned. What are you talking about? It's barely dawn. I grabbed his arm. Please, trust me. Seeing the desperation in my eyes, he nodded. Okay, let's pack up. We hurriedly gathered our gear, and within half an hour, we were on the trail back to the park entrance. As we walked, I told him everything. He listened silently, his expression unreadable. You saw the ranger? He asked when I finished. Yes, he showed me the way back. He glanced around uneasily. David, there are no old rangers working here. I checked in with the station yesterday. A knot formed in my stomach. Then who was he? Mike shook his head. I don't know, but I think we stumbled onto something we shouldn't have. We made it back to the car without incident, the oppressive atmosphere lifting the further we got from the campsite. As we drove away, I looked back at the dense forest, a shiver running through me. Weeks later, back in Chicago, I couldn't shake the experience. Sleep evaded me, and when it did come, it was filled with nightmares of that faceless woman and her haunting song. One afternoon, I decided to do some research. Buried in the archives of the local library, I found old newspaper clippings about disappearances in the Porcupine Mountains dating back over a century. One article mentioned a woman named Eleanor, a settler whose husband and child had died during a harsh winter. Overcome with grief, she wandered into the forest, singing lullabies, and was never seen again. Locals began reporting sightings of her, always accompanied by that eerie melody. Those who ventured too deep following the song often vanished without a trace. A photo accompanied the article, a faded image of a young woman with piercing eyes. But what caught my attention was the man standing next to her, a park ranger. It was the same man who had guided me back. I read further. The ranger, Thomas Grayson, had gone missing searching for Eleanor. Rumors suggested they were lovers, doomed to wander the forest eternally. I sat back, goosebumps prickling my skin. Had Thomas saved me from Eleanor's fate? I closed the book, a sense of unease settling in. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the faint strains of that haunting melody, seeping in through my window. I bolted upright, heart hammering. "Come back," the voice whispered. I knew then that a part of me had never left those woods. Eleanor's song had marked me, and distance meant nothing. Desperate, I sought out a local folklore expert, hoping for a solution. She listened patiently as I recounted my tale. When I finished, she sighed. "Spirits like hers are bound by sorrow," she explained. "They latch onto those who show empathy, who can feel their pain." "How do I stop it?" I pleaded. "You must confront her, offer closure." "How?" "She's a ghost." She handed me a small vial of salt and a bundle of sage. "Return to where it began. Lay her spirit to rest." I recoiled at the thought of returning, but knew I had no choice. Mike insisted on coming with me. "I'm not letting you go back there alone," he said firmly. We returned to the Porcupine Mountains, the forest just as foreboding as before. Armed with the sage and salt, we retraced my steps to the best of my memory. As night fell, the singing began anew, stealing myself. I followed the melody, Mike close behind. Eleanor appeared before us, her form more solid than before. The air grew icy, our breaths fogging. "I understand your pain," I called out, "but you don't have to suffer anymore." She tilted her head, the featureless face somehow conveying sorrow. "Let go," I urged, holding out the sage. "Find peace." For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, she began to fade, the edges of her form dissolving into the night. "Thank you," a faint voice whispered, carried away on the wind. The forest seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting. Since that night, the nightmares have ceased. The memory of Eleanor remains, but it's a distant echo rather than a haunting presence. I often think about Thomas Grayson, the ranger lost to time. Perhaps he, too, found peace. The wilderness holds many secrets, some beautiful, others dark and tragic. I've learned to respect the whispers of the forest, to listen but not follow blindly. If you ever find yourself in the Porcupine Mountains and hear a haunting melody on the wind, pause and consider turning back, because sometimes the most alluring songs lead us down paths from which we might never return. Story number 3. The Ghosts of Copper Harbor. I've always been a city boy at heart, but after retiring early from a stressful career in finance, I decided to pursue my lifelong dream of exploring America's lesser-known wilderness areas. That's how I found myself in Copper Harbor, Michigan, a quaint town perched on the edge of Lake Superior, surrounded by dense forests that whisper tales of the past. Copper Harbor was once a booming mining community in the 19th century, rich with copper deposits that drew hopeful prospectors from all over the country. But like many boomtowns, it eventually went bust, leaving behind abandoned mines and stories that locals preferred not to discuss with outsiders. I arrived in late September, hoping to catch the fall colors before the winter chill set in. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant aroma of wood smoke. I checked into a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple, the Thompsons, who seemed both surprised and amused by my plans to camp alone in the nearby forest. "Be careful out there," Mrs. Thompson warned as she handed me an extra blanket. "The woods have a way of playing tricks on those who aren't familiar with them." Mr. Thompson chimed in, his eyes clouded with a mix of nostalgia and something else I couldn't quite place. "If you hear the sounds of pickaxes or see lights among the trees, best to stay in your tent." I chuckled, thinking they were trying to spook the city slicker. "I'll keep that in mind." The next morning, I set off with my backpack, camera, and a map that was more decorative than functional. The trails were less paths and more suggestions, covered in layers of pine needles and leaves. As I ventured deeper, the canopy thickened, and the sounds of the town faded until only the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call remained. By late afternoon, I found a suitable clearing near a babbling brook and decided to set up camp. The serenity was intoxicating. I spent the evening photographing the vibrant reds and golds of the maples and the rugged beauty of the terrain scarred by old mining operations. As dusk settled, I built a small fire and settled into my tent, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The silence of the forest wrapped around me like a comforting blanket, and I drifted off to sleep to the gentle crackling of the dying fire. A metallic clinking woke me. First, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I sat up, the sound grew clearer, rhythmic strikes, like metal hitting stone. I checked my watch. 1:13 a.m. The forest was pitch black except for the faint glow of embers in the fire pit. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. Mist had settled among the trees, and the moon cast an eerie silver light. The clinking continued, accompanied now by what sounded like muffled voices. Could there be other campers nearby? Or perhaps local teenagers exploring the woods at night? Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out cautiously. The air was colder than before, each breath forming a small cloud. I scanned the surroundings but saw nothing unusual. "Hello!" I called out softly. The clinking stopped abruptly. Silence. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the forest remained still. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I retreated to my tent. Just as I was about to zip up the flap, a faint glow caught my eye, a small, flickering light moving among the trees about 100 yards away. It bobbed up and down, swaying gently, reminiscent of how someone might carry an old-fashioned lantern. My curiosity got the better of me. Throwing on my jacket, I decided to investigate. I kept the flashlight off to avoid spoiling my night vision, relying instead on the moonlight. As I moved closer, the light seemed to retreat deeper into the forest. I increased my pace, careful to avoid roots and rocks. The underbrush grew denser, branches clawing at my clothes. "Is someone there?" I called out. No response. I continued for several minutes until I reached a clearing I hadn't seen on any maps. In the center stood the entrance to an old mine shaft, boarded up and marked with weathered signs warning of danger. The light was nowhere to be seen. A sudden chill ran down my spine. The air here felt heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. I realized how far I'd wandered from my campsite. Turning to head back, I froze. Standing among the trees on the opposite side of the clearing was a figure, a man dressed in tattered 19th century miner's clothing. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was rigid, arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hello," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward. "Do you need help?" Still no response. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a faint murmur, a mix of distant voices and the unmistakable sound of pickaxes striking rock. Panic welled up inside me. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. As I reached the edge of the clearing, he began to dissolve, fading into the mist like smoke dissipating in the wind. I turned and ran, branches whipping against my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The forest seemed alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, and the cacophony of mining sounds grew louder, echoing all around me. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled back into my campsite, gasping for breath. The fire was completely out, and the area was shrouded in darkness. Fumbling with trembling hands, I managed to light a lantern. The familiar glow offered little comfort, but at least pushed back the darkness a bit. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, the hoot of an owl, the snapping of twigs, even the rustling of my own clothing. By dawn, exhaustion had settled in, but I was eager to leave. As I packed up, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints around my campsite, boot prints leading in circles, overlapping and chaotic, as if someone had been pacing or perhaps a group had gathered. The prints led away into the forest, disappearing among the underbrush. Back at the bed and breakfast, Mrs. Thompson noticed my disheveled appearance. "Rough night?" she asked gently. I nodded, too tired to mask my unease. I think I saw something out there." Her eyes met mine, understanding and a hint of sadness reflecting back. "The miners." I swallowed hard. "You knew," she sighed, pouring me a cup of hot tea. "Copper Harbor has its secrets. The mines took as much as they gave. Many men lost their lives down there, cave-ins, gas leaks, accidents. Some say their spirits never left." Mr. Thompson joined us, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We've tried to warn folks, but sometimes people need to experience things for themselves. Why didn't anyone do something? A memorial or, I don't know, something to help them move on?" He exchanged a glance with his wife. "There's a memorial in town, but the spirits out there, they're tied to the land, to the mines, restless." I decided to visit the memorial later that day. It was a modest statue in the town square, dedicated to the miners who had lost their lives. Names etched into a plaque, some weathered beyond legibility. An idea formed in my mind. Perhaps acknowledging them directly might bring some peace, to them and to me. I bought a bouquet of flowers from a local shop and headed back to the forest before dusk, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. Reaching the entrance to the old mine shaft was easier this time. As if the forest itself guided me, the oppressive atmosphere returned. But I pressed on. I laid the flowers at the boarded-up entrance. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," I said aloud. "I acknowledge your presence and hope you find peace." Silence. Then, a gentle breeze rustled through the clearing, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers. A soft murmur that almost sounded like gratitude. I turned to leave and froze. Standing a few feet away was the miner I'd seen the previous night. This time, his features were clearer. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow but not unkind. He gave a slow nod before fading away, the mist swallowing his form. A sense of relief washed over me, as if a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it had been lifted. Back in town, I shared my experience with the Thompsons. They listened without interruption. Sometimes, all they need is acknowledgement. Mrs. Thompson said softly, "Will they move on now?" I asked. "Perhaps," Mr. Thompson replied. "Or perhaps they'll be less restless, knowing someone cared enough to remember them." I left Copper Harbor the next morning, the autumn leaves glowing under the morning sun. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the forest, a mix of fear and respect settling in my heart. That night, in a motel miles away, I dreamed of the miners. They were working in the tunnels, the sounds of pickaxes echoing, but there was a sense of purpose rather than despair. When I woke, I felt at peace. Weeks later, I wrote an article about my experience, blending historical facts with personal narrative. It garnered more attention than I expected, sparking discussions about the forgotten histories buried across America. I received emails from readers who had similar experiences, not just in Copper Harbor but in other old mining towns. Stories of lights in the woods, echoes of labor long ceased, and figures watching silently from the shadows. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Emily, a descendant of one of the miners listed on the memorial. She thanked me for bringing attention to their stories. "Maybe now," she wrote, "they can find the rest they've been seeking." I haven't returned to Copper Harbor since, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about the miners, their lives cut short, their spirits lingering in the forests they once walked. I no longer consider myself a skeptic. Some things can't be explained by logic or reason, and perhaps they aren't meant to be. If you ever find yourself wandering through old woods or near forgotten mines, pay attention. Listen to the whispers of history carried on the wind. And if you hear the echoes of those who came before, acknowledge them, because sometimes all they need is to be remembered. Story number 4. The Dogman of Manistee Forest. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to urban legends. Ghost stories around a campfire are one thing, but believing in them is another. That's why, when my friends suggested a camping trip to Manistee National Forest in Michigan, I didn't think twice about the tales of the dogmen that supposedly roamed those woods. Come on, Jake, my friend Eric had said, grinning ear to ear. It's just a weekend getaway, fresh air, fishing. Maybe we'll even spot Bigfoot. I rolled my eyes. Bigfoot's in the Pacific Northwest. Genius. Fine, then maybe we'll meet the dogman, he retorted, wiggling his fingers mockingly. Dogman? Asked, raising an eyebrow. You haven't heard? Half man, half dog, 7 feet tall, glowing eyes, the whole shebang. Sarah chimed in. She was always into the supernatural, dragging us to haunted houses every Halloween. Sounds like a bad horror movie. I scoffed. Exactly, Eric said. So you'll come? Sure, why not? We set off on a crisp Friday morning, the sun shining bright over Lake Michigan as we drove north from Grand Rapids. The car was packed with camping gear, coolers of food and beer, and an air of excitement that only a weekend in the wilderness could bring. The group consisted of me, Eric, my best friend since middle school, Sarah, and her younger brother, Tim. Tim was the quiet type, always glued to his sketchbook, drawing intricate designs and fantastical creatures. He'd been thrilled at the prospect of sketching the forest's wildlife. The drive was uneventful until we turned onto a gravel road leading deep into the forest. Towering pines lined either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun in places. Looks like we're entering the forbidden forest, Eric joked, his reference to Harry Potter earning a chuckle from everyone except Tim, who was staring intently out the window. Hey, you okay? I asked him. He turned to me, his eyes wide. Did you see that? See what? Thought I saw something moving between the trees, he muttered, shaking his head. Must have been a deer. Probably, I agreed, but a shiver ran down my spine nonetheless. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. It was a secluded spot near a small lake, with only a couple of other campers visible in the distance. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and set up for the night. As dusk settled, we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The conversation inevitably turned back to the legend of the dogman. So, what's the deal with this dogman? I asked, more to humor Sarah than out of genuine interest. She leaned forward, her face illuminated eerily by the flickering flames. They say he appears every 10 years, stalking the forests of Michigan. People have reported hearing unearthly howls at night, seeing glowing eyes in the darkness, and finding enormous, canine footprints around their campsites. Sounds like a werewolf, Eric said, taking a swig of his beer. Maybe, Sarah replied, but the dogman walks on 2 legs and is said to be intelligent, almost human-like. Tim was sketching furiously in his notebook. I read that the Native Americans spoke of a creature like the dogman, a spirit of the forest that protected the land from those who would harm it. Well, we're just here to enjoy nature, I said, trying to lighten the mood. No forest spirits need to worry about us. Night fell completely, and the stars emerged in a brilliant display overhead. We eventually retreated to our tents, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. I awoke to a low, guttural growl. First, I thought it was part of a dream, but as consciousness returned, I realized it was real, and it was close. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. The tent was dark except for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the mesh window. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard. I glanced over at Eric, who was still fast asleep in his sleeping bag. Eric, I whispered, nudging him. Wake up. He mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by heavy footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Eric, I hissed, shaking him harder. What? He groaned, eyes half open. Listen, I whispered. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Then he froze as the growl echoed once more. now accompanied by a scratching sound against the side of our tent. "What the hell is that?" he mouthed. "I don't know," I mouthed back. We both remained still, barely breathing. The scratching grew more insistent, moving along the side of the tent as if whatever was out there was circling us. Suddenly, a loud thump jolted us as something heavy pressed against the tent wall, causing the fabric to bow inward. Eric grabbed the nearest object, his flashlight, and held it up like a weapon. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice shaking. Silence. Then, a low, menacing laugh, almost human but distorted, like someone trying to mimic laughter through a throat not meant for it. I felt a chill run down my spine. This couldn't be happening. Maybe it's Sarah and Tim messing with us, I whispered, though I didn't believe it. "Only one way to find out," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced either. He unzipped the tent slowly, peering out into the darkness. The flashlight beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "See anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Maybe it was a bear. That's supposed to make me feel better?" We heard a scream, a piercing cry that could only be Sarah. We scrambled out of the tent, adrenaline surging. "Sarah!" Eric shouted. We raced toward their tent, which was a short distance away. The flap was open, and the tent was empty. "Sarah? Tim?" I called out. No answer. Eric scanned the area with his flashlight. "Maybe they went to the bathroom?" Another scream echoed, this time from deeper in the woods. "That way," I pointed. We dashed into the forest, branches whipping against our faces. The underbrush was thick, making progress slow and treacherous. "Sarah!" Eric yelled again. "Help us!" came Tim's voice, faint but discernible. We pushed forward, following the sound. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows flickering at the edge of our vision. Then we saw them, Sarah and Tim huddled together against a large tree, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to their side. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. What's here?" Before she could answer, a growl resonated from the darkness, so deep it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. We all turned toward the sound. Two glowing eyes stared back at us from the shadows, reflecting the light from Eric's flashlight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. The creature stepped forward, into the beam of light. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a muscular, humanoid body covered in matted fur. His head was distinctly canine, with pointed ears and a long snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. "Dear God," Eric breathed. "The Dogman." For a moment, none of us moved. The creature regarded us with an almost curious tilt of its head, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Then it roared, a sound so powerful and primal that it shook me to my core. "Run!" I shouted. We scattered, each of us darting in different directions. I sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes, the ground uneven beneath my feet. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footsteps closing the distance rapidly. I dared not look back. I tripped over a root and went sprawling, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Gasping, I scrambled to my feet, only to find myself in a small clearing. Silence. I spun around, searching for any sign of the others or the creature. A low growl emanated from the darkness ahead. The Dogman emerged from the shadows, moving slowly toward me on 2 legs, its eyes never leaving mine. I backed away until my back hit a tree. There was nowhere to run. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know if it could understand me. It bared its teeth in what could have been a snarl or a sinister grin. Suddenly, a bright light flashed as Eric appeared, shining his flashlight directly into the creature's eyes. "Get away from him," he shouted. The Dogman recoiled, covering its eyes with a clawed hand. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted toward Eric. "Come on," he yelled, and we ran together back toward the campsite. We burst into the clearing to find Sarah and Tim frantically throwing things into their backpacks. "Start the car," I yelled. "We can't," Sarah cried. "The keys are missing." "What do you mean missing?" "Tim had them, and he dropped them when we ran." Tim looked devastated. "I'm sorry." Another howl pierced the night, closer than before. "Forget the keys," Eric said. "We need to get to the road and flag someone down." We grabbed what we could and dashed down the path leading to the main road. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees like towering sentinels blocking our escape. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, snapping branches, heavy footfalls, guttural growls. We broke through the tree line onto the gravel road. The moon illuminated the empty stretch in both directions. "Which way?" Sarah asked, panic in her voice. "Left," I decided, remembering that was the direction we came from. We ran along the road, our breaths ragged, the gravel crunching under our feet. A figure appeared ahead, a man walking toward us, carrying a lantern. "Help!" we cried in unison. As we approached, the man's features became clearer. He was tall, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to glow faintly. "What's wrong?" he asked in a deep voice. "Something's chasing us," panted. "A creature." Before I could finish, the man's expression changed. "You shouldn't be out here at night," he said ominously. Behind us, the dogman's howl echoed, sending a fresh wave of terror through us. "Please, we need help," Sarah pleaded. He looked past us into the darkness. "It's too late," he murmured. Suddenly, the dogman emerged from the woods, standing on the road a short distance away. Snarled, eyes fixed on us. The man stepped forward, placing himself between us and the creature. He began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, holding the lantern high. The dogman hesitated, growling but not advancing. "Go," the man ordered us without turning around. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We ran down the road until we spotted headlights approaching. A pickup truck. We flagged it down frantically. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked alarmed as she rolled down her window. "What's going on?" "Please, we need to get out of here," Eric begged. She must have seen the desperation in our faces because she unlocked the doors immediately. We piled into the truck bed, and she sped off without further questions. As we looked back, we saw the road empty behind us, no sign of the dogman or the mysterious man. We reached the nearest town and went straight to the police station. Our story was met with skepticism, but they agreed to send a patrol car to investigate. The next day, the officers reported finding our campsite ransacked and large, canine footprints surrounding the area. They attributed it to a bear attack, advising us to be more cautious. But we knew the truth. Weeks later, back home, the nightmares still haunt me. I see those glowing eyes every time I close my own. Sarah and Tim refuse to talk about it, and Eric has thrown himself into work, avoiding any mention of the trip. I can't shake the feeling that we were spared that night, not by luck but by intervention. Who was that man on the road? How did he know about the dogman? I've started researching local legends more thoroughly, uncovering stories of guardian figures who protect travelers from malevolent spirits. But one thing is certain, the Dogman of Manistee Forest is no mere legend. So if you ever find yourself in those woods, heed the warnings. When night falls and you hear strange growls or see glowing eyes watching from the darkness, get out, because some legends are real, and some creatures should never be disturbed. Story number 5. The Curse of Isle Royale Forest. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, finding solace in places untouched by the chaos of modern life. So when my old friend Mark suggested a camping trip to Isle Royale, a remote island in Lake Superior, I didn't hesitate. A week away from emails, meetings, and the incessant buzz of city life sounded like paradise. "Are you sure about this?" my girlfriend Emily had asked, concern etched on her face. "I've heard stories about that place." I waved her off. "Just old legends to scare tourists. We'll be fine." We arrived on the island after a long ferry ride, the vast expanse of Lake Superior stretching endlessly in all directions. The island was a dense tapestry of evergreen forests, rocky shorelines, and a silence that felt almost sacred. At the ranger station, a grizzled man named Tom checked our permits. "You boys heading deep into the woods?" he asked, eyeing us over his glasses. "That's the plan," Mark replied cheerfully. Tom hesitated. "Be careful out there. It's easy to get lost. And, well, some say the island doesn't like visitors." I chuckled. "We'll stick to the trails." He sighed. "Trails don't always stay where you left them." Ignoring his cryptic warning, we hoisted our packs and set off. The first few days were idyllic. We hiked rugged trails, fished in crystal-clear lakes, and marveled at the untouched beauty around us. At night, we sat by the campfire, the canopy above glittering with stars. On the fourth night, everything changed. We'd set up camp near an old-growth forest, the towering pines like silent sentinels around us. As darkness enveloped the island, an unsettling quiet settled in. The usual chorus of crickets and distant owl hoots was absent. "Feels different tonight," Mark mused, poking at the fire. I nodded. "Probably just the weather changing." He shrugged and took a sip from his flask. "Ever hear the legend of the Isle Royale hunters?" I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess, ghost stories?" He grinned. "They say the spirits of hunters who got lost and starved to death still roam these woods. Locals claim they call out to the living, luring them off the path. Sounds like a ploy to keep people from venturing too deep. Maybe," he conceded, but Tom seemed pretty serious. "Tom's just trying to spook us." We settled into our tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Sleep came fitfully. I awoke to the sound of someone calling my name. "David." My eyes snapped open. The voice was distant but clear, echoing through the trees. "Mark," I called softly. No response. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The forest was cloaked in darkness, shadows stretching like claws. A faint mist curled around the base of the trees. "David." The voice came again, more insistent. "Very funny, Mark," I muttered, stepping out into the cool night air. Mark's tent was zipped shut, no light from within. "David." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't Mark. The voice was unfamiliar, hoarse, tinged with desperation. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam slicing through the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between the trees. "Hello," I called out. "Do you need help?" Silence. I debated waking Mark, but felt foolish, probably just the wind. Returning to my tent, I tried to shake off the unease. Sleep eventually reclaimed me. The next morning, over a breakfast of instant oatmeal, I told Mark about the voice. He frowned. "I didn't hear anything. Maybe it was a dream." "Maybe," I agreed, though it hadn't felt like one. We packed up and continued deeper into the forest. The path grew less defined, the trees denser. By afternoon, we reached a secluded lake that wasn't on our map. "Strange," Mark muttered, studying his compass. "We should have hit the northern trail by now. Maybe we took a wrong turn." He shook his head. "Compass says we're heading north." We decided to set up camp and retrace our steps in the morning. That night, the atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The silence was oppressive. As we sat by the fire, Mark suddenly stiffened. "Did you hear that?" I listened intently. Nothing at first, then a faint whisper. "Mark." He paled. "That's not funny, man." "It wasn't me," I said, my pulse quickening. "Mark, David." The voice was clearer now, circling us. "We're not alone," he whispered. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse, a tall figure standing among the trees, draped in tattered animal skins. His face was obscured by shadows, but I felt his gaze, cold and piercing. "Who's there?" I shouted, rising to my feet. The figure remained motionless. "Maybe it's a park ranger," Mark suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "At this hour? Dressed like that?" The man raised an arm, beckoning. "Let's get inside the tent." I urged. We retreated, zipping the entrance tight, clutching my pocket knife. I tried to steady my breathing. Outside, footsteps crunched on the underbrush, circling our tent. Mark, David, why is it calling our names? Mark hissed. I don't know. We sat back to back, listening as the footsteps continued, sometimes near, sometimes fading into the distance. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and we drifted into a restless sleep. At dawn, we emerged to find the campsite undisturbed, save for one chilling detail. Footprints encircled our tent bare, human footprints larger than any I'd ever seen. How is this possible? Mark whispered. Maybe someone is messing with us. In the middle of nowhere, we haven't seen another soul in days. We decided to head back, but the trail we'd followed was gone. Trees we didn't recognize loomed around us. This can't be. Mark muttered, checking his compass again. The needle spun erratically. Panic set in. We were lost. Let's stay calm. I said, we'll retrace our steps. Hours passed as we wandered, the forest becoming a labyrinth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows. Look, Mark exclaimed, pointing ahead. The man in animal skins stood atop a rocky outcrop, staring down at us. Hey, can you help us? I shouted. He turned and disappeared behind the rocks. Come on, Mark said, rushing forward. Wait, but he was already climbing. I scrambled after him. Reaching the top, we found no one, just an expanse of forest stretching endlessly. This is insane, Mark said, his voice trembling. A whisper drifted on the wind. Join us. I spun around. The man stood a few feet away, eyes now visible, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Stay back, I warned, holding up my knife. He smiled, a grotesque stretch of cracked lips. So hungry, so cold. Mark grabbed my arm. Run. We bolted down the slope, branches clawing at our clothes. The whispers grew louder, multiplying. Stay with US. Figures emerged from the trees, dozens of them, all dressed in ragged furs, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. They're everywhere, Mark yelled. We sprinted blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I tumbled into darkness. I awoke to the drip of water and a throbbing pain in my leg. Opening my eyes, I found myself at the bottom of a shallow pit. The opening above was framed by roots and soil. Mark, I called out. No response. Climbing out proved impossible. My ankle was twisted, possibly broken. Help! I shouted, my voice echoing. A face appeared above, a young man with sunken cheeks and tattered clothes. Please, help me, I pleaded. He tilted his head. You're like us now. What? He vanished, replaced by another face, an older man with a scraggly beard. Join us, he whispered. Despair washed over me. Were these the lost hunters? A rope dropped beside me. Hope surged. Thank you. I grabbed it, and they began to pull me up. As I reached the top, icy hands grasped my arms, dragging me onto solid ground. Surrounded by the spectral figures, I searched for any sign of humanity in their eyes. Where's Mark? I demanded. He is with us, the first man said. They parted, revealing Mark standing among them, his expression vacant. Mark! I reached out, but he stepped back. Stay, he murmured. It's easier if you don't fight. I shook my head. No, we're leaving. The circle tightened. There's no leaving. Another voice hissed, summoning every ounce of strength. I pushed through them, running despite the searing pain in my leg. The forest blurred around me. Branches lashed at my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I pressed on, fueled by sheer will. Behind me, the whispers rose to a cacophony. Come back. Stay with us. Bursting through a thicket, I stumbled onto a trail, a real, tangible path. Up ahead, I saw a figure, Ranger Tom. Help me, I cried. He rushed toward me, eyes widening. What happened? I collapsed into his arms. They're after me. The hunters. He looked grim. I warned you. Please, we have to help Mark. He shook his head. If they've taken him, there's nothing we can do. I refused to accept that. No, we have to try. Tom sighed. Come with me. He led me to a small cabin not far from the shoreline. Inside, he tended to my injuries. Isle Royale has a way of keeping what it wants, he explained. Many have been lost to the island over the years. Why didn't you stop us? I tried, but some paths we must walk ourselves. That night, as I rested, the whispers returned, faint but persistent. David! I covered my ears, but they grew louder. Tom entered the room. They're calling to you. What do they want? To join them. Misery loves company. How do I make it stop? He handed me a small pouch. Herbs. Burn them. It might mask your presence. I did as instructed. The pungent smoke filling the cabin. The whispers faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. At dawn, Tom informed me that a boat was arriving to take me back to the mainland. What about Mark? I asked. He looked away. I'm sorry. As I boarded the boat, I felt a crushing guilt. I was leaving my friend behind. Back home, life was never the same. Nightmares plagued me, visions of gaunt faces and hollow eyes. I searched for information about the island's history, hoping for a way to save Mark. One day, a package arrived, a journal wrapped in weathered leather. Inside were entries dating back over a century, penned by various hands. They all spoke of the island's curse, of voices in the night, of being lured into the forest never to return. The final entry was in Mark's handwriting. I've accepted my fate. The island is part of me now. Don't come back. Tears blurred my vision. I knew what I had to do. Against all advice, I returned to Isle Royale. The island was as I remembered, beautiful and foreboding. Tom met me at the dock. I knew you'd be back. I can't leave him. He nodded solemnly. Then you must be prepared to face the island's wrath. We journeyed into the forest, retracing steps that seemed both familiar and foreign. As night fell, the whispers began anew. David! I'm here. I called out. Figures emerged from the darkness, surrounding us. Why have you returned? One asked. I'm here for my friend. He belongs to the island. Take me instead. I offered. Tom grabbed my arm. No, you don't have to do this. I pulled away. It's the only way. The spirits conferred silently. Then, Mark stepped forward, his eyes clearer than before. David, you shouldn't have come. I couldn't leave you. He smiled sadly. Some things can't be undone. A cold hand rested on my shoulder. Your offer is accepted. The spirit whispered. Suddenly, a warmth spread through me, and the forest began to fade. I awoke in a hospital bed, Emily by my side. You're awake, she exclaimed, relief washing over her face. Where am I? Back home. They found you unconscious on the shore of the island. Mark, is he? Her expression darkened. They didn't find him. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. I traded my freedom for his, but somehow, we'd both been set adrift. In the following weeks, I scoured news reports and reached out to authorities, but there was no sign of Mark. Then, one evening, I received a letter with no return address. Thank you. It read, I'm safe. Don't come looking for me. I stared at the words, a mix of relief and sorrow. The whispers ceased after that. The nightmares faded. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear my name carried on the breeze. David. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Michigan's haunted forests. From the ghostly miner of Copper Harbor to the eerie song of Porcupine Mountains. These stories remind us that even the most serene landscapes can hide unimaginable horrors. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, in Michigan's forests, the shadows often hide more than just trees.